It's a pleasure to join you all in the God as CEO conference, even though not in person. And I'm really going to just provide a few reflections on some questions that I pose to myself and to all of us. What place does God have in our professional lives, in our business undertakings, indeed, in our personal lives generally? I'm asking myself as a lawyer, does God have a place in the exercise of my profession? Or is that side of my life just about my learning and quoting from law books and using Latin phrases and so on? I'm hoping that some of my reflections on these questions may provide all of us with something that relates to our respective situations. I want to start, however, by just drawing some lessons from the life of David. We read the story, a story we all know so well, in 1 Samuel 17 from 22 to 50. David versus Goliath. I will dwell especially on verse 37, where David says, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And also verses 45 to the first part of 46, David saying to Goliath, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." From a tender age, looking after sheep in the field, to the critical moment facing Goliath, we see David's total reliance on God. David even had no use for the armor and the weapons of the king. His confidence was that the God who had given him victory over bears and lions, who sought to devour the sheep he was taking care of, would also give him victory over Goliath. David continues to express this confidence in the rest of the verse 46 on to the end, verse 50. "Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, we are told in that passage, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him, unquote. David went against Goliath with the weapons God had endowed him with, namely his talents and a sling and pebbles in his bag. What I cherish so much is the assurance of David. Not a self-assurance, but a God assurance. We have a tendency in our professional lives, in our business lives, to focus a lot on our professional qualifications. We look at our feasibility studies on business and the strategies that we maybe studied and that we are deploying with all the numerous consultants in our business. And these are what we see as the recipe for success in our professions, in our business. In this way, God gets treated as a kind of a messenger who will undertake errands for the business. Or at best, a security man who is to watch over our business premises. Practicing as a lawyer over these 46 plus years, I recognize more and more the need to depend on God for knowledge, for insight, for wisdom, even in respect of one's professional execution. In particular, in the legal field that I'm in, I've learned to depend on God for utterance. My becoming a lawyer itself has been a matter of God's grace and His love. I was asthmatic from an early age, and my parents were quite anxious about even my survival on this earth. Hospital admissions were a regular feature of those early years, including some with my mother lying on the floor at night beside my hospital bed. She still reminds me to this day of some of those anxious moments. Different hospitals. In fact, sometimes as I travel around, recently I was in the Ashanti region, and I think we were passing through Ofinsu and Jamasi, and I remembered the Catholic hospitals in those towns, which I had been in a long time ago. Kando Catholic Hospital was another one, Ofori-Atta Catholic Hospital, as well as, of course, Kolebu and Dr. Bannerman in Mamprobi, his clinic. I recall that the day we were supposed to do the common entrance for secondary school entry, I had an attack early in the morning. And my father rushed me to Dr. Bannerman's clinic in Kolebu. And this would have been at dawn. And the exam was supposed to be something like 9 a.m. And for my father, in that state, he thought I would not be able to do my common entrance. But I insisted, after I got a little better, that I would go and take the common entrance. An 8-year-old defying his father and insisting that he would go and take the common entrance. But by God's grace, that went well, and I got admitted to Mfantsipim School, which is also an interesting story, because the day that we had to go and do the sort of interviews for admission, the teachers from Mfantsipim who came to undertake the interview, seeing this little boy amongst bigger boys, and my brother was also not so old in terms of comparison with others. And seeing the two of us, the teachers decided that they needed to confirm that we were the ones who took the common entrance exam. So they would have us do a further written exam in their presence. And so we did. And we still managed to get through and become boarding school students at Van Spim from January 1960. The wonder of our being, of the talents that God deploys in us through our professions, in our business lives, these must also have been the sort of things that David again was reflecting on when in Psalm 139, verses 13 to 14, he sings out aloud to God, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I know full well how wonderful God's works are. Because even I, a little asthmatic boy, survived all these years and through boarding school and became a lawyer. And I'm past 70 now. To God be the glory." And so, as I've journeyed in the experience of being a lawyer, being a professional, engaging in some of the most high-profile cases, as many of you know, like election petitions and so on in our country, and in the past, involved in significant cases, let me say, involving people like Mr. William Ofori-Atta of blessed memory, one of the big six, as we call them, the powers involved in Ghana's independence history, involved in the defense of Flight Lieutenant Rawlings at Burma camp when he, God bless his soul, was also on trial after a coup attempt on May 15th, 1979. And through all of these experiences that one would call professional experiences, I've learned more and more clearly over the years that it is not just about professional knowledge and, quoting books and engaging in, this contest with other lawyers and with the court and so on. But it is also fundamentally about the wisdom and the God inspiration that enables us to give utterance to what is needed in the right context at the right time. I recall when I was involved in 2013 in the election petition after the 2012 elections. As the case was ending, it had been a long drawn-out case. We were all now required as lawyers for the different parties to give our final 30-minute summary of the main points that we were urging before the court. And I decided the night before that I would go to bed very early and I would wake up, come down to my study, and then I would write a few notes because, summarizing in 30 minutes can be the most difficult thing after a trial lasting almost 8 months and with so many different legal points. So I was going to try and sit down and write some notes about what I would put across to make the court clear that our case was the superior case. So I did wake up early that morning, and down in my study, however, I was just enveloped in an atmosphere of worship to God. And I remember one of the songs in those days that used to minister a lot to me was Donnie McClurkin's Great is Your Mercy. Great is Your Mercy. And that song was playing in my head. So of course I played it also and listened to it. And I spent the time in this worship rather than in trying to write any notes. In the end, I didn't write a single note on the paper that I had put before me. But by the time I got to court that morning, the words that I needed for that 30-minute summary, they had been formed in the same way as I was formed in my mother's womb. Those words had also been formed in my head. And I believe that 30-minute summary is something that some of you may have seen on YouTube and so on. And it is to God's glory that He prepares us for such occasions. He enables us to deliver on whatever He has endowed us with by way of talents. And I've gone through similar experiences in the election petition this year as well. In situations which seem difficult in terms of what one recognized or what one considered to be the appropriate legal results, legal outcome that should be. There were different decisions made, and yet through all that, there was a profound sense of God's ability to prevail in enabling one's professional expertise to be deployed appropriately and to deliver what needed to be delivered in the context of that situation as well. There's a hymn of Francis Ridley Havergal, which speaks to the meditations that I have as I undertake my professional assignments. The hymn says, I'm trusting Thee, Lord Jesus, trusting only Thee. I'm trusting only Thee. And in the third verse, the hymn writer writes, I'm trusting Thee to guide me, for Thou alone shalt lead, every day and hour supplying all my need. I'm trusting Thee for power, for Thine can never fail. Words which Thou Thyself shalt give me must prevail. I'm trusting only Thee. Words which Thou Thyself shalt give must prevail. I'm trusting only Thee. You know, even if we lawyers might give the impression in arguments in court that we know it all and, you know, we are quoting from here and there and so on, I think it's very obvious that it is impossible to know it all. in a profession like the legal profession. It is impossible indeed in any profession to know it all. And as we seek to put together the elements of our knowledge that are relevant to each particular occasion, there is a profound need for humility as we constantly quest for knowledge, as we seek wisdom from God Himself, providing us at the right time the right materials that we need to use in that particular case, and so on. And sometimes, for me, even with my 46 plus years of practice, the right materials are made available to me by junior lawyers who haven't even had 10 years of practice, but who are helping to pull together from the various historical precedents and so on what we need in a particular situation. So, humility in acknowledging that we don't know it all must be a key part of any serious professional endeavor. Humility in acknowledging that others can also make an input, vital inputs, even if they are sort of mere youngsters in the profession. And I believe that that is important in professional life. It's important in business life. There are businesses which in the last year and a half with COVID-19 have suddenly woken up to recognize the value of some very simple low-level employees who come forth with ideas, innovative solutions to problems arising from having to work from home in virtual space and having to adapt to COVID-19 situations and so on. And lowly workers in the organization are able to contribute vital ideas that were not introduced by the leaders themselves. So in all humility, we must learn to acknowledge that neither our business leadership or our professional execution is based on us knowing it all. Far from that. But there's something else that I want to put across, especially in the context of the legal profession. We appear as lawyers before judges. Judges who, of course, were lawyers before and over time have been appointed to the bench to decide cases. And in the human context of courts and other human experiences, there are many influences at work. Some not so positive, some negative. We've had accounts of, corrupt judges in our courts, and we know some of the other political and social influences that operate on the minds and on the work of even judges, because they also are human beings. So, as a lawyer, as a Christian practicing in my profession, I can only pray about such human influences. I can only pray that the judges before whom I make my representations are able to move beyond whatever negative influences that may be at work in their context and determine in accordance with justice, in accordance with the law. But we know that doesn't always turn out the right way. And we often see how there are intrigues at work in the legal system. I remember a case I had to do, and I got to know that a panel of judges had been set to hear the case, but not so appropriately, the other side had managed to suggest that one or two members of that panel should not be on that panel, and some other people should be put on that panel. Little did they know that their intrigues in the end actually worked in our favor, because those new people that they got to decide the case had made decisions in other cases which were exactly along the lines of what we were arguing before that court. And for that reason, their introduction onto the panel, which might have seemed to be beneficial to those who instigated it, ended up being for our good and against them, because those judges were now faced with decisions that they themselves had given, which were favorable. And that case, for instance, also showed me something about the business context in which many of these legal proceedings are also having to deal with. You know, there are business people who, if they are running, for instance, state organizations, they are prepared to run the state organizations as if it was their personal property. And they are prepared on that basis to collude against the interests of the very institution that they're working in, and that they may even be leading. And they do that for purely private gain, hoping that that private gain will not be exposed. And in a particular case that I had to deal with, this was something that was going to be taken advantage of by people who were looking to extract over $100 million from that particular institution, and who were in effect doing it alongside somebody who was supposed to be heading that very state institution. Fortunately, we were able to expose the fact that the institution itself and its organs, like the board and so on, had not been privy to what was being done against the interests of the institution. And so clearly, in these human contexts, we all have to be very alert. And indeed, as business people, I mean, there's got to be a recognition that legal compliance is important. Legal compliance such that you're not really trying to use your business just for purely personal ends. You're rather trying to advance the ends of shareholders, if it's a state-owned business, the people as a whole, whose institution that business is. So we can't, as professionals, we can't, as business people, ignore the reality of intrigue, of machinations, but we have to uphold standards, especially if we have a commitment as Christians to run businesses or to be part of businesses. These days, we hear a lot about whistleblowers and attempts to make sure that there is an encouragement of people in organizations to speak up when wrong things are being done. And the business can advance. The business can thrive. Intrigues, machinations, as I've described them, happen. They are part of the human reality. I mentioned David from the start. He had his own experiences of such intrigues and machinations against him. The very king who he had stood out for against Goliath, in the end was after him, ready to kill him. In my own case, I've had a little bit of a share of facing some of these human situations. I was tried and even in the end sentenced to imprisonment. It was a battle against the mighty power of the state. From the president to the prosecutors, the police and prison guards. This was a mighty force, a seemingly impregnable force. And court processes were undertaken, clearly orchestrated to a predetermined conclusion. It all started sometime in early 2001. I was brought before different courts. After one court threw out the case, it will be started before another court. And through it all, and in the face of this mighty power of the state, as I've indicated, I had every assurance that God was at work, even in those darkest of times. On June 18, 2008, a judge decided to give judgment against me when the case was not even over. There was an aspect of the case pending in the Supreme Court at that time. And the decision of the Supreme Court was supposed to be the following week. No notice had been served on me nor on my lawyers that judgment was going to be given that day. My lawyer had in fact written to the court to ask permission to be away because he had to travel outside the country. But there on June 18th, there I was in front of a judge determined to go ahead. And even though I didn't have notice of the judgment, the Attorney General, who was not he had not been in court for almost a year and a half because we were all waiting as the judge had directed that, when the highest courts of the land make their decision, then she would take the further decisions about the conduct of the case. But on this day, suddenly, the Attorney General appeared after an absence of almost a year and a half, and with his full team of another 3 or 4 lawyers ready for a judgment against me. And obviously it was going to be against me because police and prison officers were also ready and around the court that particular day. And so it was that in spite of every protestation of mine referring to legal requirements that, since she herself had said she would wait for the decision of the Supreme Court, there was really only a week left for the Supreme Court to decide, so it would not hurt to see what the Supreme Court would decide. But in spite of all that, that was the day that was chosen to send me to prison on June 18th. But one verse that stood out in my mind and in my heart from those first days of my being in prison was Matthew 10:28. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. On my first Sunday in the prison, I attended an interdenominational church service only to hear a really powerful sermon by a pastor from Asamankesi Global Revival Ministries, Jones Owusu Ejay. And I don't believe that he anticipated that I would be in his audience on that day. In fact, apparently, he was not supposed to be the one ministering that day. Somebody else was to have ministered, but the person could not be available. So at the last minute, he had to step in. The two sermon texts that he had were from Genesis 50:20, Joseph saying to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And Romans 8:18, to the effect that when we suffer with Christ, we also receive his glory. And so, in those months in prison, this powerful sermon in which the pastor talked about God's master plan, which prevails over all human machinations, was clearly in evidence for me, because in those months, I had no anxiety, I had no fear of the powers that be, I had no bitterness towards anyone, but I was waiting on my God. And in circumstances that were nothing short of miraculous, I survived an asthmatic attack on the 15th of November 2008 in the prison cell. An asthmatic attack that went through the night. And interestingly enough, on that evening, my wife Esther was also holding a praise vigil at our church with family and friends, praising God in the knowledge that I would be released by his power. So it was, just as happened for Paul and Silas in Acts 16. By the morning of November 16, the prison gates were flung wide open for me to be sent to hospital, initially a hospital in Soam, near the prison, and then to 37 military hospital, and eventually into the intensive care unit at the Kolebu Hospital Cardiothoracic Center, with, I'm told, the barest oxygen in my system by the time I got there that evening. I've written some reflections on these prison experiences, which have been published in the graphic. On the first anniversary, it was entitled, "God Meant It for Good." And then 5 years later, it was entitled, "5 Years On, His Mercies Never Fail." On the 10th anniversary, it was entitled, "I Overflow with Praise." I overflow with praise. There was a song, a gospel song, written by Danny Nete, which used to minister to me immensely in those months. I will worship you. I will lift up your name. You are Lord. Yes, you are. So I got into intensive care and mercifully out of intensive care, still in hospital. By January 6th, the last day of office of the president, who had been clearly the orchestrator of my imprisonment, sending a message that I was to be pardoned. And while on my hospital bed, I found it necessary to write a rejection of that pardon. A rejection of that pardon because it was clearly not in good faith. And my handwritten letter was an expression of my quest for justice, for compliance with the law. My appeal was pending, and I wanted that appeal to be the process. Just in the same way as Paul and Silas did not allow themselves just to be quietly, taken out of prison and nobody should talk about it and so on. So that January 6, 2009 presidential pardon was not for me. I chose to wait on God's justice. I think it's a Psalm 94 which says that we go to a king for favor, but to God for justice. And you may recall Moses' words to the Israelites as they were terrified, seeing Pharaoh's army pursuing them. Those are words that speak to me in many dire situations. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you. The Egyptians you see today, you will not see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." The powers that be of one day will not be there on the next day. And eventually, on November 30th, 2016, in the Court of Appeal, I was acquitted and discharged on all the charges that had been brought to me, and the sentence that had been imposed on me was quashed. Glory be to God. It was not out of my professional anything. It was not out of even my lawyer's brilliance, though my lawyer, a brilliant brother with whom I had grown from our days in the University Christian Fellowship in Legon, October 66, when we both went into first year law school. And we thank God for such brothers. I was also always proud to have by my side during the days I used to go to court another brother who had also been with me from our early school days. So both Professor Dankwa, my lawyer, and Martin Newman, who had been with me in court all the time, both of them were part of the script of God in my life. And in the time, they play their part to God's glory. On the 10th anniversary of my being sentenced, that is June 18th, 2018, a medical outreach was being undertaken by this Pastor Jones Owusu-Ajay that I mentioned, and some other pastors. And they were undertaking this medical outreach at the Nsawam and asked Esther and I to join them in this medical outreach. And a remarkable thing happened. It was an incredibly effective ministry. A lot of prisoners' surgeries. There were surgeries undertaken within the prison clinic. A lot of prison consultations with prisoners, prison officers even, who had various health conditions. And one of the prisoners walked over to me and said, do I remember something? He said, I'm the one who came to ask you for some medication for a prisoner who'd had an asthmatic attack not long before I had mine. And you had given me the medication, and I had given it to that prisoner. And I want you to know that that prisoner, his life was saved. He's come out of prison. He's now in Germany. And he never stops recalling that your medication was what saved him. And I had to say to him, the glory is to God. But that prisoner also said something which I thought was very deep. He said to me, you know, this other person to whom you gave your medication, he could have died there because he may not have had the chance to be taken out the way you were taken out, in a sense, being sort of a high-profile prisoner, as it were. I had a better chance of being taken out and allowed to go to hospital. Another prisoner previously had died of asthma in the prison. So what he was telling me was really very meaningful, that that person who had that medication, which perhaps could have saved me that night, you know, from the serious attack that deteriorated through the night, that person had a greater need for that medication than I did that night. And in the end, what happened in terms of being taken out through the intensive care unit and all that was really to provide a testimony of God's power at work, even against all the machinations. So our lives must give expression to this all-surpassing wonder of God's power. And that is why, for me, God as CEO is a telling affirmation of the importance of God's leadership in whatever context of life we are in our professional lives, in our business lives, in our personal existence, in our crises, in our successes, in everything. God is indeed the CEO and everything else. You know that the Bible gives us this account in Matthew 22 of how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, you know, their rivals. And so we read in Matthew 22, 34 to 40, one of them, that's the Pharisees, one of them, an expert in the law, tested him, Jesus, with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus provided an answer, which is a profound education about the law to us, to the world at large. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Unquote. Those profound words of Jesus provide lessons not only to lawyers, but to legislators, to leaders, and to all of us about what the law should really be about. So that as we go about our different roles in respect of the law, we may hang these profound words. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. So we acknowledge that we are not an all-powerful person that is achieving everything on our own. We acknowledge the leadership of God. We acknowledge that we are nothing but his creatures, and he is the creator. And secondly, love your neighbor as yourself. Your neighbor, however unneighbor-like he or she may seem, love your neighbor as yourself. And this is why, for me, my life must continue to be an affirmation as well as a learning about the fact that God reigns and he rules in our affairs. So we must lay our personal, our professional, and our business undertakings at his feet. We are ending as we began, with David. God's supremacy rings through various Psalms of David. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. Hence, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. And Psalm 20, verse 7, some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. God is not CEO just in church on Sunday. He is not CEO just in our times of singing hymns of praise to him. He is not CEO just at times when we feel like acknowledging him. He's CEO all the time. And yet indeed, even in church, where he should have the preeminence, sadly, we see human pastors and supposed church leaders trying to push God aside and be the CEO, the board, and everything. It is through submitting our professional capabilities, which after all are his endowments, that God grants us success in our professional undertakings. That God enables us even to go through difficulties with our heads held high. It is as we submit our enterprises to him, enterprises after all that he has entrusted us with, that he makes the enterprises flourish. It is a recognition of God as CEO in our business context, in our professional lives, that will give meaning to us praying, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And going on to pray that wonderful prayer that Christ himself taught us. I pray that my sharing will enable you to deepen that affirmation of God as CEO in our lives, of God as the board, of God. We use these analogies for convenience, but the import of all of that is to affirm constantly and comprehensively the sovereignty of the Almighty God in all that we do and in all that we are. Thank you very much. God bless you.
trusting thee, Lord Jesus, trusting only thee, trusting thee for full salvation. Great and free, I am trusting, I'm trusting only thee. I am trusting only thee. I am trusting thee to guide me, for thou